Over the course of several years, you guys have asked me a recurring question over and over again. And this is, what is the worst retcon in Dragon Ball history? And while there are other retcons that have created plot holes, there is one that stands out as being the worst. And of course, as you would have guessed based off of the thumbnail of this video, this would have been the survival of future Yajirobe in future Trunks' timeline in the Zamasu arc. Now you're probably wondering, what exactly is it about this particular retcon that makes it worse than pretty much any other retcon in Dragon Ball history? Well, for starters, it starts with the C word. And you know that Dragon Ball fans have an obsession with the C word, and I recently made a video talking about the 10 different types of Dragon Ball canon that goes more into this. Dragon Ball canon doesn't exist anymore, and the reason why is because Dragon Ball picks and chooses canon whenever it wants to, and it doesn't care whether or not there's a rubric in our minds that says this is valid and what's not valid. It combines elements of different canon and mixes them into a salad and expects fans to consume it without asking any questions. And because Dragon Ball has done this over and over again, as I explained in this video, the canonicity of Yajirobe surviving is the first violation that we can discuss here, because we actually see Yajirobe in the history of Trunks, and he's so minor in this, he doesn't even talk. We see him very briefly when Goku was dying of a heart virus in the beginning of the TV special, when we see him standing around the other Z Fighters in Bulma, and he's of course worried about his friend dying, of course, and that's pretty much it. It's extremely hard to see it, but Yajirobe did exist in the History of Trunks anime TV special. Now, when we look at the original Dragon Ball manga, there was no mention of Yajirobe. So, when Trunks was talking about how all of the Z Fighters died, there was no mention of him. So, because of that, it's kind of left into limbo whether or not he actually died or not, considering the fact that he was never really a part of the Z Fighters. He kind of just does his own thing. He's kind of like a part-time Z Fighter, but because he got so much weaker than the others who continued to train, he effectively became a side character that was brought into the show to give our characters senzu beans whenever he needed, and that's basically what Yajirobe's role was throughout the show later on after his initial introduction in Dragon Ball. And because of this, and because of the fact that he lived on Korin's tower, and the fact that the androids mostly attacked urban areas as we saw in the special, it would be believable that Yajirobe could possibly survive in the history of Trunks. But here is where the canon gets broken. And this is where we get to the filler episode, Ghosts from Tomorrow. Now, I've referenced this episode of Dragon Ball a lot, and the reason why is because this filler episode of Dragon Ball has a very different depiction of Trunks' future than what we saw in the history of Trunks, and it was effectively a filler episode that was creating a flashback through the memory of future Trunks. But from what we saw in this quote-unquote filler flashback, we see that Android 18 blasted Yajirobe in the chest. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, for starters, we have to point out that considering the fact that Yajirobe is almost always on the lookout, it would be very unlikely to expect Yajirobe to just be roaming the city randomly. And when you combine this with Yajirobe's reputation for being a coward, this also adds as to why it's unlikely that he'd just randomly be roaming the city at a time like this. But we have to also point out that it was said in the Ghost from Tomorrow that the androids specifically hunted down the Z Fighters in the future, and that even makes less sense when it comes to a character like Yajirobe. The contradiction comes when Yajirobe mentions that he was about to die, but Korin gave him his last senzu bean and died instead. Now, some of you might be a little bit confused by this if you never saw the subbed version of Dragon Ball Super, because in the English dub, Yajirobe said the androids attacked the tower, but in the subbed version, it was pretty much just said that Korin gave him the last senzu bean, and there were no details about the tower itself. But then when you get to the point where Yajirobe is in a city, and Korin pretty much never ever goes to a city, how would Yajirobe have gotten blasted, and then Korin would then somehow find a way to come assist Yajirobe and give him the last senzu bean? But considering the fact that Yajirobe mentions that Korin gave the last senzu bean so that he would live instead, this means that Korin himself was injured. But it gets even deeper than this, because let's also factor in how Yajirobe would have survived long enough in the first place. You gotta remember that Yajirobe took a blast in the chest from Android 18. Now, understand that even if you say the future version of Android 18 is weaker than the present version, she's still far beyond a Super Saiyan in terms of power. And when you consider the fact that all of the other Z fighters that were far beyond Yajirobe in strength all died with the exception of Gohan, until later on of course, because Gohan lost his arm, and then the Ghost from Tomorrow episode doesn't even show future Gohan with the lost arms, because all of the different details are completely warped, and you can now see why I was saying this is the worst retcon ever, because it's a retcon based off of something that was never shown or confirmed in the first place. So then when you start factoring in that stronger Z fighters were killed by the androids, but then Yajirobe, who was so much weaker than everybody else, would have survived, makes even less sense in all of this. After all of this, if Yajirobe somehow had survived, what was he doing all of these years? You have to factor in that there was quite a bit of time of peace after the androids were defeated. It's not like Goku Black and Babidi and Dabura just showed up. No, like, humanity was rebuilding itself. So if Yajirobe was alive, he would have shown up and resurfaced a long time ago. Like, the fact that Trunks wouldn't have heard from Yajirobe or was completely shocked to see him alive when characters in this universe are capable of sensing ki, even sensing ki signatures of people who aren't very strong, and considering the fact that Yajirobe doesn't really use ki control, it would be easier to sense him than somebody who could actually suppress their ki. This makes even less sense. But you would think that Yajirobe would still have a power level way higher than an average human, that you could still detect where he is, just based off of his natural capabilities. You see, if Yajirobe was a more serious fighter, this would have been a little bit more believable because of the fact that you could at least say he's a bit more abnormally powerful, so you can kind of write it into existence. But the thing about Yajirobe is that when he was first introduced into Dragon Ball, he was actually depicted as being very strong, being able to kill Symbol very easily, and Yajirobe also had several important feats that we saw throughout Dragon Ball, where he carried Goku on his back to Korin's tower. And another detail to consider about Yajirobe is the fact that even though he's weaker than the other fighters, he was helping them train in the anime adaptation of the Saiyan arc before the Saiyans arrived, even though in the manga this was never shown at all. So it does hint that Yajirobe was considered very powerful in early Saiyan Saga Dragon Ball. And later on, when we get to the Saiyan Saga, Yajirobe managed to inflict damage on a weakened Vegeta. Now, of course, you can say this wasn't that impressive because Vegeta was severely damaged because of all of the fighting that he had had before, but Yajirobe was strong and fast enough to cut off his tail, and he took some blows from a weakened Vegeta, which would still put him far above what a normal human could do. But then when you compare his capabilities to the other Z fighters, none of this would suggest that he could ever possibly survive something like a future android blasting him in the chest, especially if it's supposed to be in a city where Korin isn't even around. So this then leaves us to another question. Why did Yajirobe survive? Well, in simple terms, it's just that the story, as I said before with Dragon Ball Canon, just forced his existence back, even though originally we never knew what happened to him in the original anime and manga canon, and then in the quote-unquote filler, he was killed, and it was confirmed that he was killed. So then the story was like, let's just bring Yajirobe back as like a minor assistance character, and while I think he had some cool moments throughout the arc, logically it just makes absolutely no sense, because when you think about how he survived, you have to start compartmentalizing, well, what type of survival are we even thinking about? Because we never even knew he survived in the first place, or even got an idea of how he survived. Whether or not the lookout got blown up, if he and Korin were traveling throughout the city. This brings up a lot of different questions about different characters, and because this retcon is based off of a filler depiction that creates a lot of chaos in trying to understand how it could even happen in the first place, this is by far the worst retcon in Dragon Ball history. Now, as a post-edit, it's imperative to share with you that this is a problem that is solely associated with the Dragon Ball Super anime, because the Dragon Ball Super anime came out first, and the Dragon Ball Super manga was based off of the Dragon Ball Super anime. Because when you look at the Dragon Ball Super manga, there is no sign of future Yajirobe in the Zamasu arc. I quadruple checked every single chapter, And I saw no signs of Yajirobe. Toyotaro actually made a pretty good decision by not showing Yajirobe because his existence itself actually makes no sense, creates a lot of plot holes, and he's better left unmentioned even if he is still technically alive. And by alive, I mean was alive, because the whole timeline got erased.